Environmental activism has become popular in recent decades, taking many different forms. Books, like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, legislation like the Endangered Species Act, and documentaries, like Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. But roughly 100 years ago, the notion of conservation scarcely existed. Perhaps the first organized conservation activism began in 1896 through the work of Boston society women led by Harriet Hemingway. Their experiences with conflict and compromise in launching the Audubon movement contributed to the emergence of broader conservation in America. The conflict they pursued can be traced to the French court at Versailles, when Marie Antoinette added peacock and ostrich plumes to the other ornaments in her hair. It was a fashion statement that spread across Europe and then to America, becoming especially common in the late 19th century. Single feathers on hats were soon replaced by pairs of wings, and before long, entire birds. To demonstrate the extent of their popularity, a noted ornithologist of the day, Frank Chapman, decided to count all the birds he could identify on women's hats during 2 of his afternoon walks through Manhattan in 1886. He saw over 174 birds belonging to 40 different species, including woodpeckers, prairie hens, and owls. But the most coveted feathers of all were the aigrettes, the long, elegant white plumes grown by herons and egrets during the mating season. The demand for aigrettes was enormous, and by 1901 they were selling for $80 an ounce in New York City. During the mating season, then, hunters set off in pursuit of the birds.
Birds were just shot wholesale. If you've seen some of the photographs, literally piles of shorebirds. I mean, it's hard to imagine now. But people would go out and just shoot all day, and there were no limits, and there was no sense of concern that this resource would run out.
Several unhappy consequences accompanied the slaughter. Not only did early activists feel that killing birds for fashion was inhumane, but they also began to recognize the ecological benefits of preserving endangered species and maintaining balance within ecosystems and communities. Professional ornithologists tried to draw attention to the cause without success. In 1886, George Grinnell founded an Audubon Society in New York for exactly this purpose, but his group collapsed and disbanded. 10 years later, Harriet Hemingway read an article depicting the slaughter of the birds for millinery and decided to act. Though being a woman in 1896 prevented her from wielding any official authority, it also gave her the ability to influence her fellow high society women, the consumers of the feathered hats. Harriet began by inviting her cousin, Minna Hall, to tea. Together they paged through the Boston Social Register, compiled a list of the fashionable ladies, and sent out circulars inviting the women to boycott the feathered hats and join a society for the protection of birds. Many of the women Harriet and Minna contacted did join the cause. Like George Grinnell, they named their society after John Audubon, the famous artist and bird lover. However, because of the subordinate position of women in 1896, the ladies knew their society would receive little respect from the broader community without men serving as officers. With this in mind, they extended invitations to the prominent local gentlemen.
I always say that they sort of attach some token males. I mean, and that's also a distortion, but they organized this movement, and part of that organization was realizing that if they were going to be effective, since the legislators and the academic community were dominated by men in those days, that they had to be in touch with these people and work with them.
By the end of the year, the Massachusetts Audubon Society boasted 1,284 members. The end of the following year saw the formation of Audubon societies in 9 other states, many of which were also initiated by women. As the Audubon societies built up support, they inevitably provoked conflict with members of the millinery industry. One such gentleman, Harold Hamill Smith, wrote a book in defense of the feather trade. He argued, "The members of the bird societies have no more right to dictate what trimming women should wear in their hats than vegetarians have to pass laws to prohibit our taking life in order to eat flesh." In other passages, he contended that John Audubon himself and many of the male Audubon Society members were hunters and sportsmen. He also pointed out that the trade in feathers was an important source of employment. Though in the past the Audubon societies had opposed the use of feathers through legislation, in 1900 they considered a compromise with the Millinery Merchants Protective Association. It was proposed that the Audubon societies would prevent the passage of any laws that restricted the feather trade, and in return, the millinery industry would not procure any more North American birds. They would, however, freely make use of the birds they had obtained before the time of the agreement. Many Audubon members welcomed the compromise. One of them was Frank Chapman, who wrote an editorial to that effect. "We cannot hope to abolish the trade in feathers, but if, by a concession, we can so control it that our native birds shall be exempt from its demands, we shall have afforded them a measure of protection we had not expected to secure." Most Audubon members, however, including the president of the Massachusetts Audubon Society, William Brewster, were unwilling to abandon their pursuit of legal protection for all birds. With the majority of the 22 state Audubon societies opposing the agreement, it was never enacted. A second attempt at compromise was made 3 years later. This time, 12 Audubon societies signed the agreement with the Millinery Association. However, periodicals associated with the Audubon societies continued to publish articles condemning the use of feathers, and soon all compromise attempts fell by the wayside. The Millinery Trade Review announced, "There is no alternative but for the importer and the manufacturer to take up the gauntlet and meet these people in a battle royale." The Audubon societies resumed their pursuit of bird protection in the halls of Congress. By this point, one significant national law had already been passed, the Lacey Act of 1900, named for its chief proponent, Representative John Lacey. In addition to making bird protection a concern for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, it also prevented birds killed illegally in one state from being sold elsewhere. It did not, however, make any provisions for the protection of foreign birds. Congress addressed this issue in 1913 during the debate over the Underwood Tariff Bill. A pair of ornithologists, William Hornaday and T. Gilbert Pearson, argued against the trade in foreign feathers, but some in their audience were not disposed in their favor. Senator James Reed from Missouri took the floor and announced, "I really honestly want to know why there should be any sympathy or sentiment about a long-legged, long-beaked, long-necked bird that lives in swamps and eats tadpoles and fish and crawfish and things of that kind. Why we should worry ourselves into a frenzy because some lady adorns herself with one of its feathers, which appears to be the only use it has." In the hope of reaching common ground, T. Gilbert Pearson, speaking on behalf of the Audubon societies, developed a more moderate proposal that would place tariffs only on species indigenous to America. William Hornaday later reported, "The representatives of the Audubon societies asked for a measure to protect American birds solely because they were afraid that a larger request might be refused. Mr. Pearson said in his testimony, 'Dr. Hornaday is asking for the whole loaf. I'm asking for half a loaf, but I want the whole loaf.'" Ultimately, the Underwood Tariff Bill hindered the importation of plumage from wild, but not domesticated, species of foreign birds. In 1916, the Migratory Bird Treaty was signed by the United States and Great Britain to ensure mutual protection for birds whose migration patterns crossed the American-Canadian border. Each law represented a compromise between the contrasting opinions of the conservationists and the industrialists. Through this progression of laws, the Audubon movement successfully curtailed the use of birds for millinery. The Bird Protection Initiative started by Harriet Hemingway was an unprecedented event in its time.
I do believe that the Audubon movement, the movement to stop the slaughter of birds for plumes, was probably the first organized conservation campaign, which of course they didn't call it at the time, in the U.S.
I think it's not an overstatement to say that the early Audubon movement was the first widespread conservation movement in American history.
The Audubon movement shaped conservation for years to come. The legislation it developed became a model for future laws governing other conservation issues. The Audubon societies themselves, while continuing to stand for bird protection, became influential advocates for protecting the environment in other ways. Theodore Roosevelt, who later created the first national parks, was partly inspired by the Audubon movement. In a broader sense, the Bird Protection Campaign introduced the concept of conservation to the American public. Recently, Newsweek magazine recognized the influence of the Audubon movement by naming Harriet Hemingway as one of 13 environmental leaders of the century, alongside Al Gore, John Muir, and Rachel Carson, acknowledging that the modern movement rests on the campaign, the conflict, and the compromise of early conservationists.